Today, we are exploring the question, is God of the gaps actually a fallacy, and is it a fair criticism of belief in God? So this topic tends to come up in the comments whenever I post videos about scientific discoveries that could point to more than just naturalism. So I thought it would be helpful to slow down and unpack it together. I promise I'll keep it short and sweet. So if this is new to you, if you have not heard the phrase God of the gaps, this refers to the idea that people use God to explain things that they do not understand. So instead of saying, I don't know, they'll say, God did it. So the claim is that as science advances, those gaps in our understanding are going to close, and natural explanations will replace appeals to God, and then eventually belief in God will be completely unnecessary. So the question is this fair? And we're going to look at both sides of the argument now. To start, here's something that I think people who consider God to be a placeholder get right. This type of mistake, this God of the gaps thinking, has absolutely been done before. There are times where people have appealed to God because they didn't yet have a better explanation, and then those explanations were later replaced by scientific discovery. For example, something that's happened throughout human history is that people believed, lightning and thunder were caused by God, and that these were expressions of God's anger and judgment and power. Well, today, of course, we understand that lightning is an electrical discharge caused by the buildup and sudden release of electrical charges within storm clouds. Another example is disease and illness. So in a lot of cultures, people thought that sickness was caused by divine punishment or demonic activity or some kind of spiritual imbalance. But then with the development of germ theory, we've discovered, of course, that many diseases are caused by bacteria and viruses and other biological processes. So it is fair to say that appealing to God too quickly instead of saying, we don't know yet, can be a bad move. I also think that people who raise this criticism about theists have something important to say, which is that faith should not be based on ignorance. If belief in God depends on these gaps in science, then that belief is really fragile and can be threatened anytime science has a counter opinion. If faith in God is real, it should be compatible with science, right? Scientific discovery should not threaten belief. It should help people better understand the God who they believe created the universe. All that said, here's where I think the God of the gaps criticism goes too far. It tends to assume that all belief in God works that way. Whereas for most religious thinkers, God isn't being offered as a replacement for scientific explanation. Rather, it's an answer to a different kind of question, right? Science can explain how physical processes work, but not why. An example to this is that science could explain how a cake bakes, how ingredients interact, or how heat causes chemical reactions, or why a cake rises in the oven. But science cannot explain why the cake was baked in the first place, or what the baker intended to celebrate, if anything at all. Only the baker could answer that question. And so knowing that the baker made a cake for a friend's birthday, it doesn't disprove science. And then knowing that the cake needs to be baked for about 40 minutes at 350 degrees Fahrenheit for the batter to set, that doesn't disprove that the baker exists, right? Having both of these explanations gives us a more complete picture. They're complementary. My favorite scientist, John Lennox, says, the key point here is that science does not compete with God as an explanation. Science gives a different kind of explanation. On a related note, I think it's also a mistake to assume that appeals to God are always based on ignorance. There are a lot of arguments for God that are not based on gaps in scientific knowledge, but rather they're based on what we've actually learned from science, right? That the universe had a beginning, that it's governed by stable and intelligible laws, that the universe is deeply mathematical, and that its basic features fall within a remarkably narrow range that allows for life to exist, and on and on. And there are other lines of evidence as well that contribute to someone's faith, or that could contribute to someone's faith. Things like the historical evidence for the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, or our shared moral experience, why we, as a whole world tend to think that some things are objectively right and wrong, or of course, people's personal experiences as well. So the last thing I want to note is that the God of the gaps argument is sometimes used as a shortcut to avoid engaging with the argument itself. So instead of asking whether or not a claim actually makes sense, this label can get applied a little too quickly just to shut down the conversation. And at that point, it's no longer a fair critique, it's just a dismissal. So where does that leave us? What matters, I think, is not whether or not God is mentioned as an explanation. The issue is why God is being appealed to, right? Whether God is being used to cover up a lack of knowledge, or whether God is being offered as actually the best explanation to a question. And then once we can make that distinction, it becomes easier to see why some versions of God of the gaps are a real problem, even if belief in God as a whole is not. So that's it. That's all I have for you this week. If you enjoy these topics and you want to go deeper, I really recommend a couple of books that I'm going to link to in the description. The first one is Can Science Explain Everything by the wonderful John Lennox. The second is Why the Universe is the Way It Is by the also wonderful Hugh Ross. And then in the comments, if you're up for it, I would love to hear about your own conversations around God of the gaps, whether you have encountered it as a criticism or a concern, or even ways that science has influenced how you think about your own faith. Of course, if you have questions related to this topic or other topics connected to Christianity, you can put those in the comments too, and I will try to respond there or in a future video. And if you want to see more content like this, you can click the subscribe button somewhere below the video, and I'll see you next week.